William Webster, Professor of Political Science and the William Webster Chair for Social Science at Kalamazoo College. She is working on various issues of women's rights and anti-Semitism at Hebrew University. She's also worked on behalf of the rights against anti-Semitism domestically and within European studies. Amy's been lecturing on these summer institutes quite regularly, and I think, and I'm not saying this to be polite, I think her work is really profound and innovative and adds a very important dimension to understanding contemporary anti-Semitism and various issues in terms of gender and the like. So Amy, thank you for coming all the way here. And the floor is yours.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just want to dive right in because we don't have so much time together. So aside from just being thrilled to be here, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start talking about gaslighting, rape denialism, and the Manosphere. We're early days into the Institute, but contemporary analysts typically attribute anti-Semitism to a couple of things. You've heard it before. The escalation of political tensions in the Middle East, right? Socioeconomic uncertainty and the rapid transmission of conspiratorial myths. Left anti-Semitism, right anti-Semitism, Islamic anti-Semitism. And one of the things that I note almost all the time is that most of these folks avoid almost entirely the explosive eroticization that excites antipathy against Jews, and that antipathy is a hatred that its proponents can deny. And by contrast, one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on is the recent of anti-Semitism is the eroticization of it, so that we can really better understand what's going on. I'm going to, the reason that I'm doing this is I'm interested most in the ongoing efforts to silence experts, including sexual assault survivors who came forward for the majority of victims who couldn't because they were murdered. And with rape denialism connected to October 7th, I'm going to be making the argument that that denialism is as varied as it is vast. Now, what I'm going to do, though, is focus on the most recent efforts to silence the survivors. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit less on the initial occurrences that some of you may know about and of which I've spent a great deal of time writing about in the last year or so. My outline is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to be providing a brief history of gaslighting. Then I'm going to be offering a very short history of Hamas and its October 7th crimes. And then last, I'm going to be turning to three anti-Semites from three seemingly distinct markets. That is, I'm going to be focusing on the porn star Mia Khalifa, the so-called progressive Manosphere bro Hassan Piker, and the legacy journalist and her work most recently in The Guardian, Naomi Klein. So it's not left, right, Islamist. It's really about, if you will, the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. So I'm going to begin with gaslighting, because that is the title of this work. So first, some historical context. While in the previous generation, Freud and his followers maligned women and girls as neurotics who somehow imagined sexual abuse as fantasy, in this century, those testifying to Hamas's sexualized sadism have been similarly undermined by those determined to dismiss the terror of October 7th, and not just October 7th, but the knock-on effects. And whatever the similarities in these deceits, there are two key differences. First, the most fervent deniers were previously men of science, and now they're frequently women, many of whom identify themselves as feminist. And second, and I think more importantly, this century's targeted rapes and the denials connected to them function as a crucial weapon in the arsenal of those seeking Israel's obliteration. Hamas's effectiveness in doing this depends as much on the sexual barbarity of its male perpetrators as it does on the audacity of their women supporters, who repeatedly imply that either the abuse never happened or that it was grossly exaggerated and, in the words of Naomi Klein, weaponized. Countering such gaslighting requires that we first understand what gaslighting is. And tempting though it may be to dismiss today's deniers as those who we needn't take seriously, I'd like us to recall the enormous influence that Freud and his followers have had for decades in terms of our ignoring and excusing child sexual abuse. Florence Rush's groundbreaking work in 1971 exposed Freud because she was able to reveal that although he initially believed his patients were suffering from sexual abuse, his persistent exposure to the incrimination of their fathers left him on edge. And in strongly identifying with the men of his class, Freud altered the record to protect those men, and thus found it necessary to undermine the perceptions of his female patients as fantasy. Eventually, what Freud did was he succeeded in gaslighting an age into ignoring the devastating reality of child sexual abuse. And his disciples have prolonged that deceit under the therapeutic guise that includes a stunning misunderstanding of female sexuality and a cover-up not just of the sexual abuse, but continued sexual exploitation, as we've heard it before, sex work. And perhaps no movie has better captured the undermining of women's perceptions than that 1944 film here, Gaslight. And Gaslight centers on a husband who, having married for money, endeavors to have his wife institutionalized by altering her faith in the world that she inhabits. An ambition that I would argue isn't altogether different from terrorists today, which is to alter our faith in the world that we inhabit. So one of the things that the husband does is he intentionally misplaces his wife's belongings. He endeavors to have her servants do things that he later denies. And in the end, he convinces his wife that a flickering gaslight is actually steady. And then as he feigns concern for her well-being, she gradually questions her own faculty. That the title of this work became a verb testifies to the film's power in exposing indoctrination. Reluctant to attribute gaslighting solely to the fallacies of Freud and his followers, Rush implicates the age in which their logic reigned to replace religious mysticism. And it was under the auspices of science and reason that seemingly enlightened men like Freud enjoyed a credibility that was then and continues to be a credibility that's denied to most other people. Florence Rush was no less a product of her time. And by that, I mean that she was inspired for, and she was inspired by, and she wrote for a 1970s burgeoning feminist movement that questioned men of science without abandoning science altogether. After all, her methodical logic and reliance on empirical evidence helped Florence Rush to reveal Freud's ruse. And yet, as dissatisfaction with old orthodoxies mounted, many, not least feminists, began to mistrust, if not outright reject, science entirely. And postmodernists soon became the beneficiaries of such skepticism. This is the case such that by the 1990s, modern science was repeatedly depicted as little more than a narrative, a social construct, and so on. Now, those whose lives had been belittled under scientific pretense may have welcomed that development. But postmodernism was ill-positioned to provide any of them much relief. Its misuse of scientific jargon, its disdain of facts, and epistemic relativism actually enabled postmodernism's proponents to paper over injustice as a matter of perspective as opposed to fact. Feminists and Holocaust scholars were especially concerned, while Holocaust scholars like Deborah Lipstadt despaired that the increasingly popularistic, relativistic approach to truth extended legitimacy to the Holocaust denial that was going on. Feminists understood then that negationism that negationism would extend from just Jews to include women, such that it became possible to have a theoretical annihilation of women. A really popular position that was taken up by the so-called French feminists like Julia Kristeva, a Bulgarian French psychoanalyst who famously insisted, and I quote, "A woman cannot be," a position that left academics then, and it's particularly common now, to wonder if one can even define what a woman is. Postmodernism's cavalier approach to truth extended as well to itself and its troubled provenance. When in 1987, its principal founder, Paul Deman, a Yale University professor, was revealed to have been a Belgian Nazi collaborator who championed the removal of Jews from Europe as a young journalist, many of his protégés mobilized, and Jacques Derrida, a leading postmodern social critic of Western philosophy, was key among them. And he characterized the revelation of Deman's Nazism as, and I quote, "a war on his mentor." I would say that more recently, Jews are similarly rebuked for having drawn the public's attention to New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani's past, and specifically his calls to globalize the Intifada. Rather than concede that the phrase is violent, that phrase has violent implications for Jews, the foreword often contends that the resulting unease among Jews has spawned Republican Islamophobia against the democratic socialist. M. Gessen's similar view in The New Yorker and in the New York Times has prompted a conception of anti-Semitism that would actually exclude contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism, seen here. Let's hope that this works. That commentators are often more attentive to the reputations of these men than the dire consequences of their rhetoric is alarming. The repellent rhetoric and criminal behavior of ostensibly peaceful protesters is so often misrepresented as impassioned pleas for the oppressed that it scarcely registers concern, and it should concern us. Consider the New York Times' recent coverage of Britain's Glastonbury Music Festival. Even while conceding that Jews have been attacked and demonized in the name of Palestinian justice, Michelle Goldberg attributes the singer Bob Dylan's death chants against Israel's IDF to, and I quote, "the massacres in Gaza and the minefield of taboos around discussing them." The following week, Campaign Against Antisemitism issued a clip of the bare-chested singer Bob Dylan on stage in Athens before a sparse crowd, accompanied by what I would consider to be a cringe-inducing drum solo. Dylan frenetically goose steps for 30 seconds before a Palestinian flag arm extended. And you know what? There were no viral examinations of his gestures that followed. Instead, the clip was conspicuously absent from the countless curated posts featuring Bob Villan's professed concern for Gazans, having proposed that discussions of Palestinian casualties are taboo while ignoring Hamas's deliberate use of Gazan civilians as human shields. Michelle Goldberg and countless others exempt Hamas from the war crimes it perpetuates and it perpetrates against those it claims to represent. So the question is, who is Hamas, and from whom and how are they and their followers seeking to free Palestine and globalize the Intifada? Some of you may already know it was founded in 1987. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which claims, and I quote, "The Quran is our constitution, jihad is our way, and death for Allah is our most exalted wish." Hamas is an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, an organization that is officially recognized and designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, the United Kingdom, Argentina, Australia, Japan, Israel, and all 27 member states of the European Union. And as with all terrorist organizations, it employs calculated violence to foster a climate of fear in order to reach its objective. And its objective is the imperial expansion of Islamism, which is Islamic fundamentalism. Hamas's call for Israel's obliteration is an essential ingredient of that Islamist future. And rejecting all compromise on this matter, its founding charter of 1988 calls upon Muslims to murder Jews for having usurped Palestinian land. Although Omar Bartov once described the charter as offering, and I quote, "the most blatant anti-Semitic statements made in a publicly available document since the pronouncements of Hitler," few journalists detail Hamas's genocidal ambitions in print, a reluctance that unfortunately now extends to Mr. Bartov himself in the New York Times. And in this way, the charter elicits a similar response to that which journalists and others extend to, well, pornography. That is, even among those who are presumably against it, one observes a reluctance to divulge and unambiguously disavow its contents. In revising the charter on the heels of the 10th anniversary of ruling Gaza in 2017, Hamas declared that its conflict is, quote, with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. So it's still with the Jews, but not because of their religion. And so Hamas directs its ire against the racist, aggressive, colonial, and expansionist Zionist project. These are the placards that you see, right? The placards that you see and the petitions that you're reading are over and over again from the charter. So please note that. You're seeing all the time a repetition of the charter's context. Hamas's stated opposition to all forms of religion, ethnic, sectarian extremism, and bigotry, which is in Article 9, their claim that they reject all bigotry then actually sanctifies its terror against Israel as a political necessity, especially for a very ill-informed and gullible Western public. And this is a great example of this. In 2018, Hamas's leader stood in Gaza City beneath these portraits of, Gandhi, King, and Mandela, three icons of the nonviolent resistance movements that they represent, and he proclaimed Hamas's new great return would be a, quote, blessed protest that would be, and I quote, national, peaceful, popular, and civilized. Now, this is 2018. Having ostensibly renounced the suicide bombings, the rocket attacks, the attack tunnels that have been and continue to be signature components of Hamas's war against Israel, he then admits that the protest would be the organization's best, quote, deadly weapon. And so it's become. Far from, and this is what we really have to appreciate, far from discrediting Hamas, that kind of mixed messaging resonates with a generation who regard Israel as a pariah state and themselves. We really need to understand this. This mixed messaging helps those who identify Israel as a pariah state and themselves as so uniquely committed to social justice that their reliance on violence is rendered essential to social justice. I know that's a lot to think about, but Israel's a pariah state. We are uniquely committed to social justice. Violence is a signature component of that. And if you think that this is just, theoretical, right? Indeed, this is just a couple months ago, in 2025, Elman Trust Barometer, which is an annual global survey of over 32,000 folks across 28 states, found 54% of respondents between the ages of 18 and 34, that is to say our students and our younger coworkers, said that they approve of violence, they approve of property damage, and they approve of misinformation as tools for social change. We really have to understand that, otherwise we'll get nowhere, okay? So that's over half of people between the ages of 18 and 34, that's what they're thinking. So then I'm hoping that this makes sense to you. Hamas's increased reliance on women is absolutely no small feature of this war. And in its efforts to secure legitimacy for itself, it helps to also boost the egos of those women needing reassurance that their lives matter. And so we see this. In the previous charter, just so you know, like the 1988 charter, women were, quote, permitted to fight the enemy. But their primary role was as the makers of men, and in particular of Islamic men. The revised charter states that women are to play a pivotal role in the project of resistance. And this pivot to a more, active role for women likely stems from a hard-nosed calculation that you see here about how best to accomplish Israel's end. Because Palestinian women, and you see this is Devorah Margolin's work, because Palestinian women had greater freedom of movement and access to potential targets, she found that Hamas and many others began leveraging women to circumvent detection and carry out attacks. Whether knowingly or not, I'm arguing that women continue to serve Hamas in its cognitive, it's not just the physical war, but the cognitive war. And these women are apologists for and even celebrants of and deniers of terror, including the terror of October 7th. While that day became synonymous with terror, it's important to recognize a few things about that day, not least of which it was Shabbat. It was a day of rest. It was Simchat Torah, which is a Jewish holiday celebrating the conclusion of one annual cycle of public Torah readings and the start of another. And on Simchat Torah, Jews dance enthusiastically with and are said to be literally the legs for Torah. And the Nova, and I don't see many commentators seeming to note this, but the Nova Dance Festival was in many ways the secular expression of this. And on Simchat Torah, Hamas and its terrorist affiliates, because it wasn't just Hamas, targeted the dance festival and nearby Jewish villages where they incinerated entire families, raped women and girls, cut off their breasts, tossed them about, gagged and shot bullets into the heads and also the vaginas of their victims, beheaded others, and pulverized pulvises beyond forensic recognition. Captured terrorists acknowledged that the sexual violence was intentional, and the premeditated character of that violence was evidenced in a dead terrorist's notebook that contained a translation key, and in Hebrew it read, "Take off your pants." And those 4 words helped to account for the bloodied corpses of so many naked below the waist. One captured terrorist confessed to actually having received permission, which tells you about the permission structure and the systematic nature of this. He said that he had received permission to rape a young girl's corpse. Another explained that the reason that they kidnapped women was to rape them. An UNRWA teacher bragged that he had captured a sex slave. UNRWA staff are very involved with Hamas. In fact, I would argue inextricable from, as the UN Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. The Wall Street Journal suggested that about 10% of UNRWA staff are Hamas. We can come back to that later. Now, in terms of, in sync with the technology of our times, the terrorists posted selfies of their exploits from cell phones and body cameras to the thrill of their own relatives, the larger public, the devastation of the Jewish world, and the friends and families of their victims. Their behavior is not only reminiscent of pogroms, but of the Serbian fascists who used rape and the pornography that they made of it, in the words of Natalie Nenadic, as a public spectacle to induce women to leave their homes and never return. That one set of perpetrators raped, quote, for Serbia, and another to, quote, free Palestine, doesn't mean that the rape was then or that rapes are now the perpetrator's only tool, or that women and girls are their only victims. Hamas forced Israeli hostages, including a boy who was just 12 years old, to repeatedly watch the videos that they produced on October 7th. And held alone for 6 weeks, Hamas told that young boy that his kibbutz and that Israel no longer existed. That Hamas's sadism has repeatedly been hailed as, quote, resistance, testifies to an indifference to, if not valorization, of lost lives, including those Palestinians over whom the terrorists continue to rule. The so-called resistance also, I think, attests to the depth of anti-Semitism and the normalization of sexual abuse that accompanies it. Its women supporters, together with their superficially progressive male counterparts, have evaded charges of sexism while playing a significant role in silencing and casting doubt that sex crimes even occurred. And this is really important for us to understand. To assume their doubts are genuine, that these doubters are genuine, is to miss entirely their motivation. As Vidal Naquet explains, there are few ways to better rehabilitate anti-Semitism than to suggest that the crimes associated with it never happened, were exaggerated, or hardly crimes at all. So that's what's going on with doubters. Feminists have long noted that rape itself is hardly criminal, unfortunately. In fact, it's often codified. Now, on October 7th, as the horrors were unfolding, Mia Khalifa, that's Mia Khalifa, tweeted the following to her innumerable Playboy subscribers, quote, Can someone please tell the freedom fighters in Palestine to flip their phones and film horizontally? Despite Playboy's swift termination of her contract, Khalifa maintains 6 million followers on X, 26 million on Instagram, and another 38 million just on TikTok. Those three venues feed her OnlyFans channel, where she identifies as a sex worker. A year later, okay, October 7th, as the horror is happening, she texts that on her Playboy subscription channel. 1 year later, this is in the New York Times, a promotion of Mia Khalifa. What the New York Times is essentially doing is it's tapping into her 68 million followers through its fawning coverage of her. And the journalist asks, quote, because you can't make any of this up, how does feminism manifest in your work? Depicted months earlier as a so-called progressive feminist icon at the Oxford Union here, for her seemingly critical stance on the sex industry, Khalifa rhapsodizes about the boundaries that she sets with her OnlyFans fan base, and she professes her profound commitment to human rights. Turning to her pro-Hamas tweets, and in keeping, I would argue, with Hamas's revised charter, Article 16, the journalist insists, and I quote, while you're anti-Zionist, you're in no way anti-Judaism. That's Article 16. So I want us to be very familiar in paying attention to placards, the questions that journalists ask, and the petitions that you read. These are taken sometimes word for word from Hamas's own charters. Having thus contextualized her genocidal anti-Zionism as consistent with feminism and in no way connected to anti-Semitism, this journalist then reflects on her characterization of October 7th footage as, and I quote, a Renaissance painting. And he fails to address why this sadist, Mia Khalifa, wants that painting filmed, quote, horizontally. Even more than porn, explains Ross Anderson, applauding Hamas has given Khalifa the most important currency in the internet economy. And what is that most important currency in an internet economy? It is attention. And I would say, might the same not be said of the New York Times, with its deference to Hamas and its deference to supporters like Mia Khalifa. And I say this because months later, we have this. In April of 2025, the newspaper transitions from its faux feminism to the Metro Manosphere with a positive profile of none other than the pro-Hamas influencer Hassan Piker. Here he is. And you can see that he credits himself with his own post with having Jewish American teenagers sympathizing with the terrorist group Hamas. The newspaper's coverage of this multi-millionaire paralleled, because it's not just the New York Times, it paralleled the New Yorker magazine's embrace of the self-identified socialist as the left's answer to winning over the MAGA bros, emphasizing, and I quote, the dating advice and motivational speeches he provides his nearly 3 million young male followers on Twitch, which is a live streaming platform. The magazine concluded that he, quote, this has to have been written by a graduate of gender and sexuality studies. The magazine concludes that he, quote, tries to mold a more capacious, it's one of my favorite words, a more capacious view of masculinity. So it may have seemed impolitic for any of these journalists to mention his more notorious statements, such as when he insisted, and I quote, it doesn't matter if the rapes happened on October 7th. It doesn't change the dynamic, for me. I mean, look at the pose too. He's totally jacked up, sexed up. Doesn't change the dynamic. Evidently, his position doesn't change the dynamic for the New York Times, The New Yorker, or even for Time magazine, which this month recognized Hassan Piker as one of its top 100 creators for 2025. I want to make the argument that for Piker, for Khalifa, and all of their fan base, which millions, probably like 1 billion fans, these folks, for all of them, Hamas and its supporters are absolved from responsibility for rape and the celebratory filming of it, because why? Because it functions as an apt punishment for Israel. The sexual abuse has therefore not only been decontextualized as assaultive, it's been reconstituted as sex work, art, speech, but beyond that, since October 7th, it's been refashioned as resistance. And moreover, the extensively documented nature of those crimes, including by the terrorists themselves who documented themselves, all of that matters little. And it matters little because pornography has seldom been regarded as evidence of harm. And this factor testifies to the success that men and the women who associate with them have had, not only in concealing sexual abuse, by making it so obvious and photographing it and celebrating it and excusing it. It's because sadism is so central to it. Those willing, and this is the sad part too, I mean, it's all been sad, but those willing to concede that the rapes happened and that the murders occurred, nonetheless direct our animus away from the Islamists who perpetrated them onto Jews themselves. Writing for The Guardian on the first anniversary of October 7th, Naomi Klein asks, and I quote, "What's the line between commemorating trauma and cynically exploiting it?" Her question elicits an inevitable conclusion in which she accuses Israelis of, quote, weaponizing their trauma to justify their, and this is from the Charter too, imperial aggression and grotesque human rights violations. Now it's interesting because had Klein instead considered Hamas's imperialistic calls for a caliphate, had she considered the murder of Jews, had she considered Hamas's cynical use of Palestinian civilians whose death itself describes as, quote, necessary sacrifices that provide leverage over Israel, she may have reached a different conclusion. Perhaps Klein would have noted the unprecedented efforts taken by Israel to protect civilians and that peace is an anathema to Hamas. Or perhaps she would have discovered that Israelis are a people no less deserving of solace and sovereignty than any other people. Yet in having foreclosed these possibilities, Klein so indulged the normalization of anti-Semitism and the sexual abuse that is so central to it that she imagines, and I quote, as it gets worse, so many prominent Jewish leaders want, and that was italicized in her article, so many Jewish leaders want Israel to have suffered a modern day Holocaust. That's in The Guardian. And the question is, why? Why is she writing like this? And she answers, her theory is that they want to call for a new genocide. That's another quote. These Jewish leaders want to call for a new genocide. And if you ask against whom, she will tell you the Palestinians. Naomi Klein's reversal of victim and offender is familiar to feminists. It's very familiar to us. And it's actually known as DARVO. So I just want to go through DARVO now. DARVO stands, as you can see, for one, you deny. Secondly, you attack. And the third thing that you do is you reverse victim and offender, DARVO. You can think, if you're into pop culture, Johnny Depp. You can start thinking about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, or Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. But one of the things that it really does is it entails sexual abusers denying their crimes by consistently attacking the veracity of their victims so that they can assume that role of victim themselves. And this ploy, so it's very, very common when you deal with sexual abuse, this ploy is augmented by anti-Semitic depictions of Jews as manipulative and even genocidal, while terrorists, this is exactly what Naomi Klein did, while terrorists are portrayed either as victims of false allegations or those whose barbarism is, quote, understandable and even, if you will, justified. By the way, Article 25 of the Charter, where it can be justified. After having lectured about rape denial to over a dozen campuses and more community organizations following October 7th, I worry that rape's normalization under the pretense of social justice will actually result in the restoration of corroboration requirements that feminists globally ended decades ago. And I say that because if after the extensive documentation on October 7th of sexualized murders, people choose to remain incredulous, none of us is safe and credible. And one of the things that I hope to do today is to do this by extending Darvo's application to Jews: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. I'm hoping by using Darvo, we can better grasp the success that anti-Semites have had in actually increasing the threshold of what constitutes harm, so that very few, if any, transgressions against Jews qualify as harmful, because that's what they've done through Darvo. Again, data is important. It's not everything, but everything's data. Consider the ADL's survey of over 1,000 Americans following 3 major attacks that I mentioned earlier on a slide. Those attacks occurred between April, in the United States, between April and June of this year. In April, there was the firebombing of the governor of Pennsylvania's home, the night that, later on in the night of a Passover Seder. The double homicide outside of a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C., that was May. And in June, we had the torching of Jews who were pleading for the release of Hamas hostages. So those 3 events. After those, and this is very recently, the ADL polled 1,000 Americans. And while the organization found that the majority of those polled neither endorsed nor excused the attacks, 22% of those 1,000 polled stated that those 3 attacks were not anti-Semitic. 14% said they didn't constitute hate crimes. But most worrying, I think, is that 24% of them, a la Naomi Klein, said that they were staged to gain, or cynically exploited, right? Staged to gain sympathy for Israel. 13% said that they were justified, and 15% said that those attacks were, quote, necessary. That Klein, the most reputable of those 3 influencers that I've just considered, advanced genocidal inversion in The Guardian on the first anniversary of October 7th, under the pretext of wondering how one might commemorate that day's trauma. It suggests, as do the stats that I just mentioned, that we've reached a new nadir in anti-Semitic gaslighting. One finds that those presumably opposed to rape and murder, justifying, excusing, or misdirecting these crimes by insisting that Jews provoked or staged them. This is the last slide. So I hope that by exposing their venal antics that we can move forward in helping to repair the world. And so I look forward to the the time that we've got remaining to engage in question and answers and to address maybe some things that have come up earlier in your session. So I will stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with a question. Is this on? It will. Can you hear me?
You switch on the lectern.
So Amy, thank you very much. Here, in a lot of your work, you look at how
Switch on the lectern. Turn on the podium.
Oh, come on up.
Yeah.
How many PhDs does it take? So Amy, thank you very much. So in your previous work, you look at issues of S&M in the feminist movement, the feminist intellectual movement, vis-a-vis issues of anti-Semitism. So how does this horrific chapter of the evolution of anti-Semitism fit into your previous work, which I found very powerful and enlightening, illuminating?
So it's still there. I mean, that's what this is.
I know. So has it reached a
It-
new
it-
level?
it's-
And is the under? So I guess I'm thinking of Judith Butler and others. Have they sort of set the intellectual stage? Have the ideas filtered down to get the for progressive, educated Americans to buy into this? Like, what's going on?
So I refuse to acknowledge or to identify Judith Butler and that crowd as feminist. They have repeatedly gone out of their way. They were about gender studies. And so one of the things that they did was they entered in the 1980s into what were once called women's studies programs, and now we seem unable to recognize that we exist. They entered into that. They conflate women and gender, where I'm opposed to sex roles. Gender is a sex role. And they were real pronounced advocates, and people forget this all the time, for the pornography industry. That's what they did in the 1980s. They argued against those of us who identified pornography as a civil rights violation. That is to say, no prior restraint. And we knew then, as they would speak at places like the Barnard Women's Conference in 1982, we knew then as they were getting dressed up in sadomasochistic garb and Nazi uniforms. And you can, by the way, see this if you're flying on British Airways, which I just did coming in. And there's a whole documentary about Madonna, and if you watch it all the way through, she's performing in that kind of sadomasochistic regalia. So it's all been normalized, but back then in the 1980s, not so much. They were in keeping with postmodernism because it became impossible to draw connections between the abuse that they were advocating or being able to recognize that they're pro-Nazi. I don't think it's coincidental that the sadism that they were advocating back then, and raising the threshold of pain, and raising the threshold of who got to be, and the perpetrators of that pain get to be feminist. I don't think it's coincidental that we got here. I don't think it's coincidental if you look at Hamas's behavior, that they were tying women and sometimes men to trees and then raping them. Now we've got poles in hotel rooms and women taking dance classes so that they could perform, what's in the pornography. It's been completely mainstreamed, and so nobody wants to talk about this, right? Because people are kind of consuming it privately and then thinking that they're not really part of this, and we have the mainstreaming of sadism. And if you have the mainstreaming of sadism, you have people who are attracted to this, reifying it, performing it, and then it becomes impossible for any of us to talk about how we're harmed in that way, because they're all exempting themselves from the kind that they like, right? And then it's online, and we saw this. We saw this behavior in the academic world in the 80s. We saw postmodernists arguing that everything's open to interpretation. By the 90s, we have the rapes of women in concentration camps. I'm talking about Bosnian Muslims and Croatian Catholics. And we had these women, including at Ms. Magazine, one of whom was the daughter's general from one of the generals who in the former Yugoslavia was involved in this, engaged in denying that those rapes had occurred. And then there's a denial about what's referred to as snuff pornography, which is on the dark web. So we saw this in the 1990s. And I knew then, that we were in deep, deep trouble, because in raping to free Serbia, this became resistance. And we knew then that this was happening. And that was before we have OnlyFans, Twitch, Twitter, all of this. And this is what people are consuming all the time. So it's no coincidence that they don't even see the harm. It really is resistance. And when it's done when these rapes are done against Jews, it's apt punishment. And I don't think that we understand that. And similarly, we don't understand when people appear to be so incredulous. And by the way, I understand incredulity, right? It's so overwhelming. How can one take it in? But oftentimes those who claim to be the most incredulous actually know that this is what's going on and derive pleasure from the angst within our community in trying to express our harm. This is very much tied also to Holocaust denial. And we could go back to the romanticization of those stories as well, which would freak people out to think too much about this. Well, this is a long time in coming. So that's a kind of long answer. Yes, it's very much tied to, I would think, the mainstreaming of sadomasochism, particularly within so-called women's studies programs.
Sabrina?
Yes. Thank you for your really fascinating and deep lecture. I have a lot to process and I guess a lot to say. The Darvo tactic was familiar to me because I've experienced it both in a sexual context and in the context of anti-Semitism. So I think that exposing that is certainly something that's valuable and that we can take out of this room and apply more broadly. But the second thing that piqued my interest was you quoted Omer Bartov, and I actually wrote my thesis on him and how postmodernism blurs the lines between scholarship and activism, and how he is a representation of that, together with his shift, previously condemning properly the anti-Semitism, and now, I guess, endorsing it. So I guess my question is, now that you've identified that this was a long time in the making, why do you think we've failed to discern and really put a stop to these, I guess, philosophies and paradigms that have led to this blur and now genocide and rape inversion, and what philosophy should we re-infuse to bring ourselves back if we can, or if you think there is some redemption that we can have in this crazy world?
So I'll identify myself as having always been secular. Jewish education. It's very simple. I think it's heartbreaking. I think Jews are a people who are a central part of our identity is to extend mercy and to be incredibly generous. And I think that we've extended that to the people who want to destroy us. and not to ourselves, right? In feminism, we'd call it horizontal hostility, which, I mean, some people would probably accuse me of having done by criticizing, but I don't consider them feminists, you know, women who have appropriated feminism. So I think that we're very vulnerable as a people who have been accustomed to thinking very seriously about others, having been so otherized ourselves, but we can't, I think, without Jewish education, make those necessary distinctions about how to best extend mercy. And I think that we have been, unfortunately, and I say this as somebody who's experienced that, incredibly assimilated. And that I think has caused a significant rupture for us. And so we extend generosity. When somebody's not quite clear, we go out of our ways to explain. And it hurts, right? And it doesn't occur to us that in having to perform that explanation, that, going back to the first question, the sadists are delighting. So, I mean, it's very hard, but I think that's been key for a lot of us. It's certainly been key for students on campuses, because Chabad is really the only place, not even Hillel, is the only place that's really left for a lot of those students to go to. And I think the more of us who teach have an understanding of that in terms of this generation, the better off we'll be. And by the way, that includes our Gentile colleagues as well, to become familiar with those outlets. So I don't know, I think that we have to learn from your generation as well, because I think that many of us are clueless. We understand what's happening in the classroom. We don't have as good an understanding of what's happening in the cafeteria, what's happening in the dorm rooms, what's happening all the time to you online, for those of us who are older. So I think we have to be in conversation, but I would say Jewish education is 100% key in maintaining any sense of sanity that we can get at this point.
A brief comment, I profoundly agree. It's a profound question, a profound answer. I always speak about Emmanuel Levinas, who was rooted in Jewish thought, how we need, once we see our face in the face of the other, we're human. We need the other to be human. But, which I haven't spoken about here, and we can speak about it another time, but just very briefly, he also goes on to say that any social movement that does not perceive the other as fully human, i.e. that we come from the urine of donkeys and pigs and apes, which is in the Hamas Charter as well, that we have to obliterate that ideology. We have to defend the sanctity of humanity. So we don't turn the other cheek, we have to fight it. So, and I think with Tikkun Olam, assimilated Jews, it's difficult to get that point across. Anyways, Professor.
Thank you so much. I mean, I know your work, and I know your work. So thank you so much for this talk. But even more importantly, thank you so much for your work and your clarity and your ability to just sort of be a tree standing in this tsunami of madness of inversion. And you stood strong for so long in that. So thank you for all of that. And then could we go back to the bro, the slide about the bro for a second? I just wanted to see if I misunderstood something. Yeah, in this headline, this is a very trivial point though, but if you look at this headline, it's 1/3 of Jewish American teens say they sympathize with Hamas. Yep. Now look below that, it says survey shows 66% of Jewish teens. So, having once been in math, and I'm making this point, those are headlines, right? Those are New York Times headlines and sub-headlines, and they invert the probability, right? It's going from 33%, it says 66%. And I know it sounds like a trivial point.
It's just Palestinian people have a very Hamas. It's different.
Although it's poorly. Oh, it's the 1/3 of them? Okay, I see. There's a difference there. Okay. So it's not a mathematical mistake. Oh, sorry.
And the only reason I do this, I really do this, is because gets portrayed as just being pro-Palestinian.
Right, no, that's,
And then he posts this. So.
right.
I mean,
Right.
just, come on, people.
Yeah.
I mean, not to draw too much, you know.
Yeah, my bigger point, that was a small one. My bigger point is also to commend you for the recognition about what journalistic malpractice is. Not only that it doesn't happen, it is, right? I mean, you know, I work with medical malpractice. I'm very involved with you know, countering medical malpractice, but medical malpractice is the exception. And I would say that what you're showing us here is that journalistic malpractice is the rule at this moment, not the exception. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. So you gave the examples of Mia Khalifa, Hassan Piker, and Naomi Klein, all of whom are so-called progressives, or regressive progressives, as some others have called them, with how they espouse rape denial.
By the way, Mia Khalifa, I don't think that any of these people really, I mean, he's identified as being with the progressive.
Sorry, with how others
Yeah.
identify them as progressives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see similar behavior on the right, for instance, in the case of Andrew Tate, given his significant influence over young men? And how might men and women on the right who engage in October 7th rape denial compare in their rhetoric and their justifications to those on the extreme left?
Wow. So thanks for that question. I'll start with the Tate and then I'll work over. So the Tate brothers, if they could be seen as bringing in a completely other voice, right? They too might find themselves on the top 100 great creators, right? But they've been charged. I think it's probably only a matter of time before this guy might as well, given the attitudes that he promotes on Twitch. I think one of the things that you'll find when you look at the pornography and you watch the different performances is that continuum of left and right, and Mark mentioned this yesterday following David Harris's talk, it's not helpful. I don't find it helpful. Those of us who are feminists never found it helpful. Because if the left was as pro-feminist as it claims that it was, we would never have needed a feminist movement. We had a feminist movement because women came out of the left and they said, you're treating us horribly. We had a civil rights movement because so much for the left, they cared about class and not race. They used to call that, you know, identity politics a long time ago. So the very movements that the left claims to represent or speak for, and they're really kind of, they appropriate social movements that found them to be unresponsive, including, by the way, the Green Movement. That's what the left does. The right does that too in terms of morality, right? Both of them claim to be so socially just. They may not use that term in the same way. So for many of us, for many, many years, we didn't find it, that dichotomy to be very helpful. Although sometimes I have to force myself into that spectrum in order to make myself be understood. I don't think it really matters for those who are interested in power. If you look at Hamas itself, right, it is appropriating, to go back, you know, it's appropriating social justice movements, right? It doesn't seem to make much sense, but the whole point is that they don't have to make sense, right? It's the same thing, you know, the right doesn't have to make sense. The left doesn't have to make sense. These are people who are identifying themselves as socialists. They're multimillionaires. These are so-called progressives, right, who talk this way about women. So all of those labels, I think that we really need to throw them out. I don't really care about how people identify themselves. What I care about most is how they behave. And I can't, going back to the end of your question, I can't discern in terms of the actual behavior. I can't consistently describe them as being the left, the right. I think we just have to, they're anti-Semitic. They're woman-hating. They're racist. I mean, they're classist, incredibly classist, right? So I think I want to distance myself from that.
Thank you very much for your amazing talk. Especially I like the insinuation that there is some implication from Butler's promoting of the raising of the threshold of pain and then being completely oblivious when it comes to the violence committed on October the 7th. But I wanted to ask about precisely this picture because I didn't catch what you said that Hania announced that they were doing. Because I thought I heard you said they renounce violence because of these people in the back, these icons of anti-violent movements. But then now you're saying that they said that the violence is a necessary tool in the cause of the resistance, or what was the...
I think it's intentionally misleading. But it works every time. This is why I'm progressive. No, I'm the left. No, I'm the right. We shouldn't care. He gets up and he does this. This appeals. It's like women's studies programs are pro-Pal. This one is anti-this. They use these icons. They know it's going to play really well. He refers to his own party. He refers to his own party as nonviolent. I'm going to quote, it's a blessed protest, the Great Return, and I'm sure somebody's going to talk about what the Great Return is, right? The Great Return is to obliterate Israel. The Great Return is going to be, in his words, a blessed protest. In his words, national, peaceful, popular, and civilized. You can start thinking about the behavior of Hamas. And he says that, and what was interesting is back then, the New York Times in 2018, they covered this. This is a picture from the Times. And then they said, within minutes of his saying that, he then said the following, that it's going to be, he admits that this program is going to be Hamas's, quote, deadly weapon.
That this national, peaceful, civilized...
is going, and so we have to listen to them when they say these things. We really have to listen.
So there's this contradiction, even in this, even one sentence.
Correct, that's the contradiction.
The people who protest will be dead.
Now or you called it a contradiction. I'm arguing in my talk that mixed messaging, it's exactly that mixed messaging that resonates with the generation, and then I gave data from 18 to 34, they don't see it as a contradiction. We have to appreciate, they don't see this as a contradiction, because if Israel is a pariah state, and this generation is endowed with being the real purveyors of social justice, then using violence is essential to reaching that just goal. And I just gave the Elman Trust barometer that just came out a couple months ago. 54% say if it's property damage, violence, and lying, as long as you reach that just goal, you're fine. It's good. And that's what we really have to appreciate. By the way, it's not just Elman. There are lots of polls that suggest that younger generations think that violence is okay. I think recently something like 40% of Democrats say that if violence is necessary to get rid of Trump, go for it. So we can't, I'm done thinking in terms of Republican, Democrat, left, right, I'm saintly, I'm educated, no, I'm elite, in all these colleges. Similarly, it's mixed messaging. We've adopted to mixed messaging in ways that I just can't exaggerate. If you're now at an elite college, you're the proponent of what? Democracy? Why are they so central to democracy? It's like they're so elite. So we are in a really topsy-turvy moment. Sadism, masochism, elite, democracy, violence is okay. Violence is actually central to becoming a nonviolent icon. This is disgusting, and this is appropriation. But no, but this is appropriation. But people just don't see it, right? And then I love Larry's comment. I hadn't thought about it. This is journalistic malpractice. All they're doing is once you read the charter, you can see all of the articles coming up again and again and again, whether on cell phones at demonstrations, on placards that I showed you originally.
At our university, they had a quote from the Hamas Charter. They put a large poster in front of the university building, actually, and it was. And then when I wrote the report on it, I showed the picture and I showed the Hamas Charter. It was saying stop the genocidal expansionist imperialistic project. Word for word from the Hamas Charter. Yeah, you're right.
No, I think.
I'm sorry, I am in the wrong group, by the way. I didn't drink enough coffee this morning. Amy, good.
You're meant to be here.
Yeah. So, Amy, good to see you again.
Lovely to see you too.
Excellent presentation, I really love it. When you talk about violence as justified, I mean, this comes straight from Denialism, like for instance, and even anarchism, where even the innocent are responsible just by being indifferent, right? Or Jews are guilty just by living in Israel, so it doesn't matter whether it is a baby or whether it is. And so it's all justified. And I think to a certain extent Hitler actually also adopted some of these early communist ideas about, an enemy has to be destroyed. Class struggle means, killing the upper class, whatever. So, very good point, I like it. But I have a different question, which is, it's amazing to me that the Jewish tokenism that we are seeing, Naomi Klein, Judith Butler, even in Michelle Goldberg.
I call them Jans. Jewish as needed.
Jewish as needed, right. And I have the feeling, yesterday, we were talking about some sort of going backwards in America, where we again have this element of Jewish tokenism. Biden asked Chuck Schumer, the Jew, to say that Netanyahu has to go. Okay? Forget about what you think about Netanyahu. I'm sure we have a different idea, but we all agree that that was absolutely inappropriate, and not to speak about Nadler. And then we have Jewish tokenism again with Omer Bartov and the article that he, Naomi Klein, I never heard. I don't know where she's coming from. Obviously a feminist, but we are seeing in all these conferences that are organized by the social justice, always a Jew presented something against Israel. I'm talking about these conferences that are being organized, in non-profit organizations. I know because my wife works for government, and that's the kind of things that they organize. How do you explain that?
Because it legitimizes them. That's how Judith Butler became Judith Butler. Honestly. That's how a lot of them entered into women's studies, is they made the men who were administrators very, very comfortable. That's what, so tokenism, I don't think is just something that Jews have to experience. I think all historically oppressed groups have to deal with this. And you're right. They're being used in horrible ways. I don't think that those who are in those prominent positions mind.
And I think they willingly do that too.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. What I thought a lot about before and then during your presentation is how a lot of these, influencers, I keep thinking, what comes first? Their hatred of Jews, women, themselves, whoever it is. you know, when it comes to, you know, rape and sexual assault, it's about that, it's about power. Now that manifests, so I wonder, for a lot of these influencers, are they jumping on the anti-Semitism bandwagon because it's always so trendy and popular? And with anti-Israel, you know, what comes first, especially think about Mia Khalifa, you know, for years she got a lot of hate for her work, sex, pornography, and also for being an Arab. And then now she's being portrayed, you know, as this icon and all these things. And I hope I'm making sense. I just wonder what comes first and how all of this ebbs and flows, especially with whatever's trendy in how we people, just like Jews.
Well, what do you think? What do you think comes first? And here's a slightly different question. Do you think would it help you to know which came first at this point? Does it help us? Some of you think yes.
Is this rhetorical or?
No, I'm totally, I really mean that. Because by the way, here's my short answer, I don't know. But I do know it's just taken off incredibly. I mean, I know that because of the internet, words that I didn't even know before suddenly become important, right? And they're insane. I can give you a whole list of insane words that are central to the academy now that are just insane. And then people just start repeating it. Now, I don't know what's the problem, that we're so vulnerable and we're so naive, or, you know, was it figured out before? I don't know which comes first. So that's my short answer, which wasn't so short. But does it matter? Because then it's going to change how we respond. It'll change how we respond. So I don't know.
So we have a bunch of questions. Rhoda?
Okay, thank you so much for doing this work, first of all. Thank you. I wonder a couple things. One is I want to know where you're going to go from here. And then I want to know whether you believe there is room for collaboration between, so you're talking about both how basically, and I've experienced this as well, anti-feminists infiltrating women's studies, and certainly anti-feminists infiltrating feminist legal studies, and how they've taken the narrative. And I feel like in my gender and law class, I'm deprogramming my students, and just even the suggestion that pornography is not consensual and that it's, you know, exploitative, that's brand new information for them.
Correct.
And we also see anti-Zionists, who for me that's anti-Semites, infiltrating Jewish studies.
Correct.
And the same result. And I'm not sure, I'm wondering, in my personal experience, it seems like among the Jewish women who are woman-centered feminists, they seem less susceptible to also the anti-Israel narrative. I don't know why, I don't know if this is an age thing. Okay, so that's my question, is what you're seeing there. So where are you going to go from here with this? What are you seeing in terms of collaborative opportunities between these groups of kind of more traditionalists who are, I think, staying more true to the original missions of both Jewish studies and women's studies?
So personally, in terms of going forward, I'm working on a book that, in which this will be a chapter. That's okay. In terms of collaboration, how we go forward, and also the resilience of Jewish women who are women identified. So here's something that this will also be a chapter. Are you filming this now? Oh, that's too bad.
We can cut it out.
Yeah, okay.
Just note the time. Note the time. If you want to cut it out later, tell me.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So, partly because it's my book, but partly it's a matter of tactics. So I want to dispense of this notion that Me Too unless you're a Jew. Not bright. Not bright for anybody who has suffered from sexual assault. because Me Too didn't really extend to them. Me Too was a hashtag. Me Too was about celebrity. Me Too was not about most women. Me Too isn't about the Yazidi women. Me Too isn't about the Kurdish women. Me Too isn't about the women still stuck with Boko Haram. Me Too. So when we do that as Jews, it's empirically incorrect, and it is just a way that we isolate ourselves. Two, I don't think it's coincidental that a lot of these women have completely discredited feminism, which was largely, there were two things that were key to the post-World War II world in terms of advancing. One of them was a civil rights movement, and the second one was the women's movement, and I mean worldwide. In terms of the women's rights movement, particularly in the United States, though not entirely the United States, it was a movement that was overwhelmingly led by Jewish women. And that helps to explain the incredible denigration of that movement by those who claim to be, quote, critical, right? Because once you can do that, then you can co-opt that movement, completely denigrate us, and then move on. The reason that I think, and this is really important to know, the reason that I think that so many Jewish-identified, really Jewish-identified women are relatively speaking impervious to the insanity, and this is somewhat controversial, I understand, is because Judaism is a matrilineal identity. Notwithstanding our efforts to be more egalitarian, so we say things, particularly as secular folks, paternity matters as much as maternity. But historically, that's not true. And in many ways, quite frankly, Jews were intelligent enough to figure out it wasn't true then, it's probably not true now. No offense to anybody. If you understand that, you understand, one, why we were central to that movement, and two, that it is not coincidental that we have, and I kind of mentioned it with the postmodernism, the annihilation, it's not hard to skip from the annihilation of Jewish existence through Holocaust denial to understanding the denial of women, which the postmodernists used so-called French feminists, by the way, none of whom they were psychoanalysts, what a shock. Never themselves were they part of the French women's movement, but there's no other, it's interesting theoretically, there is no other national group that's like American feminism, UK feminism, but there was French feminism for the postmodernists. And what they did was they questioned whether or not women exist. And at the time, 40 years ago, with the rise of sadomasochism, the rise of postmodernism, the rise of do women even exist, this has been going on for a long time. And now we are, well, can we even define what a woman is? So I think that women who have grown up in a kind of women-centered space and understand Holocaust denial and can understand how insane the rest of this is, are relatively speaking more impervious to lots of really insane things.
Amy, that was wonderful. Your thesis statement was completely supported all the way through. I have a lot more studying to do, so thank you. It was wonderful. But one of the first things I'm going to do is read the Hamas Charter. Maybe everyone in the room has done that already. I have not. So thank you.
But both of them, by the way, because then you start seeing when they pivot to understand how to appropriate civil rights. Both of them.
Both. Okay, so just a few things. The first is, well, I mentioned reading the charters. You had, when you mentioned the 18 to 34-year-old survey, there was a small percentage that you mentioned with the word misinformation. Was it like 13% of the 18 to 34-year-olds actually approve of misinformation?
So 54% approve of three things.
Yeah.
Violence,
Yeah.
misinformation, and property damage. 54%.
But that misinformation part, that's very critical. That's a very key thing when we're thinking about that particular age group and how they gather their information. I'm thinking about my students, I'm thinking about the fact that I'm building courses. or a course at least first, to help bridge the blacks and Jews, particular histories and particular futures together. But knowing that that was a part of the approval was misinformation within that group, so I didn't mishear that.
No, you didn't.
Oh my goodness, that's absolutely alarming.
But
Okay, good.
now you understand as a professor as well, so this is focused, I use this to talk about Jews. But in terms of what it is that we do in the classroom, if misinformation or using AI or just lying is particularly helpful in achieving your final goal, which is a degree, to then pursue social justice, or just to, it would be just for me to have a degree, then we understand the logic. And we really have to understand that this is the logic at play.
Yeah, so that's also very key because of the mixed messaging. Okay, got it. Oh, okay, good. Got it. The mixed messaging element that you were underlining instead of, what was the word you were just using? Not contradiction. Yeah, contradiction. Love the mixed messaging. Last point. I'm thinking about the term feminism, and I'm thinking about the U.S. concept of feminism, and I'm thinking about the black feministic movement that spun off from not the white feminist movement, as some I'm not a feminist scholar at all, but I am very aware of the racial divide there when black feminists approached white Jewish feminists in the United States and said, can we join you, after the civil rights movement, feeling that there was a gender, actually a sex divide during that. And there was a split up, and we know about that with Angela Davis and Bell Hooks and the whole lineup of black feministic scholars.
We think that we know a lot about that, and I would make the argument that what it is that we think we know is really wrong.
Well, you're exactly right. I think I'm saying that I know a little bit about it, I don't know a lot of it. But you're right, if I don't know a lot of it about it, most people don't know as yet, sure. So, but my point that I'm getting to, that I'm trying to synthesize in my own mind, is building these bridges back. So, if we are in the world, the war that we are, fighting for humanity, fighting for Jews to be considered humans, actually, and I'm thinking about the fragmentation that exists, with scholars realizing that first, African American women tend to see themselves first as black, and then maybe they're even spiritual heritage, and maybe then tied with spiritual heritage, their gender, whereas most non-black women see themselves first as women, and then other sets of identities, but not all the time, but comparatively. Comparatively.
Sorry, time's an issue.
Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry, Charles. Okay, just want to see how, if you see some way of building that bridge back that was split in the beginning of the black feministic movement versus the main feminist movement globally. To help with Jews.
So language matters a lot to me.
Yeah.
And the fact that we walk around and we refer to everyone as a guy. And supposedly, what are my preferred pronouns? Okay. So then you told me what your preferred, and then you turn to the guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or then I'm not a gender.
Yeah.
I'm actually a woman.
Yeah.
I'm sexed. It wasn't. I wasn't. What's it called? Assigned. When I have a temperature, it's not assigned. It's recognized.
Sure.
So we are in a profoundly messed up state. And I would argue that so many of my students, and this is sad, but this is where we are now, or as they would say, where we're at. This is where we are now, is that many of them don't want to be women and girls.
That's true.
In fact, actually, the more that they don't conform to sex role stereotypes, otherwise known as gender affirming care, they will call themselves non-binary, which is also fascinating. So we are in a really topsy-turvy world where I don't think that the old ways of looking at things are very helpful, but they think that this is new. And this is the annihilation of Jews. This is the annihilation of women and girls. And we have to, I think we have to make that really, really clear.
Thank you.
Well, And unfortunately,